Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišák, and I work as the deputy head of the foreign desk at the Slovak Derby Pravda, which by the name means truth, and is not the Russian Pravda. After many years of correspondence and phone calls, I finally met Cas Mudde in person last year at the Globsec Forum in Prague. Our meeting resulted in the 235th episode of the Global Agora podcast. This year, we crossed paths again. The result? Another round of conversation. This time about the sanewashing of US President Donald Trump, the threat of the far right, the normalization of Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, but also about the cancellation of the Late Show with Stephen Colbert. Cas Mudde is of course a professor at the University of Georgia and one of the world's foremost experts on populism and far-right politics. Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. You can find the link in the description of this episode. And now, on to the new debate. Cas, do you watch the late night shows in America?
No.
No. Because, my question is about, I don't know if you know, but I'm asking this because as we speak today, it's May 21st, and the Late Show with Stephen Colbert is wrapping up.
Mm-hmm.
It was cancelled, and it is widely seen as a step basically trying to please President Donald Trump because he's regularly attacking comedians and late night show hosts. So you said you don't watch late night shows, so I'm not going to ask you if you miss the Colbert show. But on the other hand, do you see this phenomenon and I think I can call it the Trump's regime trying to take control over the media environment in the US?
Yeah, so first, I kind of stopped watching most political satire under Trump 1 because, they really don't do that much anymore because life is so crazy that they rather just say something that the president actually said and it sounds funny, but because he actually said it, it isn't funny. Now, I think the whole Kimmel-Colbert thing just shows how important Trump is. Right? These shows are moderately important. These comedians are not overly critical. US doesn't really have biting satire, but it's something that Trump watches or hears about. And anything that directly connects to him is important, right? And so that's why he kind of lashes out. Now, the thing is, and this is something that Chomsky wrote about decades ago, is that the US media has for a long time, but certainly over the last 10 years, become owned by people for whom the media is not the most important part of their business. And most of these businesses, think about Amazon and Washington Post, but many of the others too, most of their money they make through the government, right? And so they are not going to take any risk with their big business because often their media, which barely makes money if it doesn't lose it, could antagonize the president. Now, I think that the case recently of CBS goes even further than that. There they actually buy the media to please the president. Again, the question is, do they actually believe it? Ellison might be. Obviously, Musk is far right. There are some other people who seem to be really far right, but others, by and large, just want to ingratiate themselves with the president so that they can make massive amounts of money through other deals. And I think this is, in many ways, this is the Hungary playbook.
It's something I want to ask about because it seems there are some similarities with what Prime Minister Viktor Orban, now ex-Prime Minister Viktor Orban, did in Hungary, the neighboring country of mine. So do you see some similarities?
Yes, although for me, the model is much more Putin, because Putin was way earlier with that. And in Russia, of course, this happened too. Oligarchs started to, either they already owned media and then they made them censor, or they bought media to, again, ingratiate themselves with the president or prime minister, whatever Putin was at that point in time. So that is what then, by and large, other authoritarian leaders introduced, like Orban, but you see similar types of things happening in Israel too. I think what makes the US different is there's much more space. There are also other financial models. So Hungarian media, for example, if you don't get money through the government, then there's pretty much no money. In the US, that's much less the case. And so I think one of the big difference between the US model and the Hungarian model is that in the US, pretty much the vast majority of media started to kind of fold well before there was pressure. The Washington Post was an example, but to a certain extent, the New York Times has been sanewashing Trump without true pressure. And I think that is different. I'm not sure whether that is purely about capitalism, because New York Times is doing pretty well at the moment. I think it has a lot more to do that U.S. media has always been pretty mild and pro-status quo.
I would agree with this, but also I want to ask you about this sanewashing of Donald Trump. You can get this from your perspective as a political scientist or a politicologist, as you like to say. But I think this is a question also for us, for journalists, for the media, we are really still trying to figure out how to cover Trump for over 10 years. It seems so, at least in the US, because it's very rare you can see in the US somebody saying openly in the mainstream media, Trump is lying, or Trump is really saying, basically, excuse my French, but almost everything that Trump says. My question would be, what the fuck are you talking about, Mr. President? And I think it would be a same question. So how to cover Donald Trump's presidency without sanewashing him?
First of all, we talk about the media as if they're a watchdog of democracy, right? And I think that is a problematic position because the media is a business. But as a theoretical exercise, let's act as if it's the watchdog of democracy. So I think, first of all, the media should explicitly take a pro-liberal democracy position for the simple reason that an independent media can only exist within a liberal democracy. And so you either take yourself serious and then you have a position on it, or you just let everything go. That's the first thing. The second thing is there should be objective, norms. Lying is bad. And just because everyone lies, does it make it less bad? And if someone sometimes lies, it's a fundamental difference with someone who almost always lies. Those differences have to be pointed out. I think it's important to emphasize how different certain things are. Even if you don't want to make it normative and say that's bad or good, you have to emphasize that presidents don't normally start court cases against their own government. They don't normally, by and large, extort favorite press from the media. They don't threaten journalists. And you have to not only note that it's normally not done, but you also have to put that in context that this fundamentally challenges liberal democracy and is dangerous from that perspective. I think all of those things don't happen. The other thing is if someone just goes on a rant, but pretty much all the time, if anyone else would do that, we would have conversations about their mental state, about potential interventions. We would ask, what is the circle around them doing, right? We don't have these conversations, and that is truly disturbing because increasingly it is clear that it is truly one man who determines almost everything. And that man is, first of all, very old. I don't want to speculate about his mental state because we get an indirect view, right? So that's one, also not a psychologist. But everything points into a direction of someone who is not overly stable and clearly who doesn't respect boundaries about limits of power. All of these things are unlike what we have seen before by a stretch and dangerous to the system that is the legal system. You have to problematize that. Otherwise, people don't understand what the problem is. And one of the things in which this happens is also the both-sidism, right? And so for weeks and weeks of rants and attacks, they're being kind of put on the same level by the president. As one attack by some low-ranked Democrat, which if you're not well informed, you think, okay, so everyone does it, so there's nothing to see here. And that is the way that the New York Times covers Trump, pretty much. Like, it's not as if they don't say that he doesn't do those things, but they don't point out that it's exceptional. They don't point out that it's dangerous. And they both cite it by saying, well, someone on the Democratic Party also once had this.
In a way, we can also say that maybe it's even worse, at least from my perspective, because somehow we are now used to what Trump is doing. And if the other side says something a little bit more crazy, we tend to think about the other side as even worse, because Trump is just Trump. Others should behave much differently.
Well, that's clear, right? And so the media has been writing for almost a decade now that, well, Trump is not held to the same standards by the voters as others, but he's not held to the same standard by the media. And the voters get their information largely through the media. And so it might be true that a significant portion of his voters don't care, but that is not an excuse for the media not to care, right? And I think that, again, there is this hiding behind neutrality, which even on that, the media is not consistent, because the New York Times does have regularly stories about corruption or lying or whatever. But then it also has all of these other types of things. And I think the other thing is, I think it's a general media issue, but certainly in the US, certainly with respect to, let's say, the right or the far right, everything is seen as an incident. Whereas, for example, if you have two Islamist attacks in half a year apart, then they're part of a trend. And they're always discussed together and contextualized, etc. The far right does things all the time, but every single one is as if it's the first time. And so, yes, if someone would go off on a rant or threatens once, then that is probably not a story. But he has been doing this since his first term. Whenever someone is critical, particularly if it's a woman or a person of color, he attacks them. He is also consistently racist. He speaks about low IQ people almost exclusively, about black people. It's insane that that is not called out, that we don't have stories about that. Because this is not even like xenophobia. This is pure racism, early 20th century type racism. And the media brushes over that, right? So then it's up to the individual reader to figure out whether that is remarkable, problematic, whatever. And again, what I dislike is the hypocrisy. Like, it's okay to be neutral. And I think it's useless, but it's your right. But then you actually are neutral all the time, which also means you give an interview to a neo-Nazi or an Islamist and you just let them speak. But we don't. We all the time have positions. But when it is towards power, we, like media, start to become much more docile. And this is a broad phenomenon. I mean, the media in Europe was much more critical towards the far right in the 1990s when they were irrelevant than today, where we come up with all kind of euphemisms like populism or conservative to talk about the far right. And that's just, the fact is that most of the media are not overly critical of power.
Cas, and talking about the far right, you recently wrote, and I will quote you, "The far right constitutes the most serious threat to liberal democracy today. This being said, the far right threat is not existential everywhere and is overstated in some narratives. At the same time, the far right threat to liberal democracy in America and Europe emanating from US President Donald Trump is still mostly understated." End of quote. So let's try to unpack this also in the context of Viktor Orban's loss in Hungary. First, where is the far right threat existential?
So the threat is existential, first of all, in terms of the program of the far right. So the far right is fundamentally against liberal democracy, particularly checks on power, minority rights, independence of media, judiciary, academia. Not only in word, but we know this indeed. Like, we've seen that in Orban, we've seen that to a certain extent with Meloni, we certainly see that in the US. So leaving aside that increasingly far-right actors are even undermining democracy per se, as we see, of course, with the attempted coup d'etats in Brazil and the US, we see in a certain way in Orban's Hungary. On top of that, because the far-right is in power or close to power, that is not just a theoretical threat. So in that sense, right, it's not the same threat as the 1920s, 30s, right? They don't want, or they will probably not try to implement a totalitarian state as the fascists did. They don't do away with elections, but they try to make them pretty much relatively free but unfair so that they stay in power. Those are important differences, right? On top of that, the US model is different from Orban's model. It's interesting because Orban was seen as an extreme form, and in some ways it was. In other ways, it was a remarkably non-violent authoritarian regime. Compare that to what we live through in the US, with ICE roaming the streets, with critics being taken to court. I mean, that barely happened in Orban's case. So I think that the threat is fundamental. It's not the same threat as fascism was. It is also not the same in every country, as said. Slovakia, for example, is an example of Fico falls very difficultly to place these days, right? But the same Latvia, for example, or Estonia are countries that don't have a far right in power or with a lot of power. The Netherlands in and out, like, those are important differences. But if you look individual at every country, then almost every country, the key threat to liberal democracy is from the far right.
To what extent is Donald Trump now a liability for the European far right?
So that depends on what Donald Trump is linked to in the domestic discourse, right? Because most people get their news domestically. If Donald Trump is linked to tariffs, to Greenland, to abandoning Ukraine, to threatening Europe, they're a liability. Attacking the Pope, very important in countries like Italy. If he is linked primarily to immigration and corruption, fighting corruption, draining the swamp, he's not a liability. And so what you see with the far right is they move towards and away from Trump. The embrace has never been that full, though, because most far-right actors in Europe understand that Trump is non-ideological. And so he's not really one of them. People like Meloni, like Le Pen, they were born and raised almost into the far-right. It's an ideological thing. It's a community thing. They look at Trump and they know, A, Trump is unpredictable. B, Trump's about Trump, right? And while he is racist, and he has some of the same enemies, he can always come for you. So they never fully embraced him, but they liked to be close to him because it's the most powerful person in the world who, by mere fact of being, helps normalize them. But when he says something that is very unpopular, they will rarely criticize him, because they also don't want to be attacked by Trump. And I think most far-right leaders are pretty aware of polls, and so they know that A, Trump is extremely unpopular in Europe, but Trump is even not particularly popular among their own supporters. According to some polls, about 50% thinks positively, and that is not when we talk about Greenland or things like that. So they're very aware of that. They are aware that on the one hand, having Trump is very important because you can say, look, whatever we say cannot be marginal because the president of the US says it. That whenever you're being attacked, that you will isolate your country if you come to power. You can say, but the president of the US will be very happy when we come to power. Those are massive things. Think about Marine Le Pen, who has been marginalized for decades, where people have always said, if she becomes president, then France will become marginal. Now she can say, when I become president, the US will want to work with us. Putin will want to work with us, right? So those are important things for these type of people, particularly the far right, who are not fully accepted yet. With someone like Meloni, it's very interesting. She first positioned herself as kind of a bridge, a Trump whisperer, which helped her.
Even with Elon Musk.
Yeah, which helped her elevate her position even more. But she's now so mainstreamed and normalized that she actually doesn't need that. And of course, with Trump going after the Pope and she facing elections next year, she was reasonably outspoken in that. But next year, she can embrace him again. Like, if at that point in time, Trump is seen as a symbol of fighting the old power, then she will do it.
Interestingly enough, you mentioned Trump's unpopularity. The case of Slovakia is very telling. Just after he was elected for the second time, the supporters of the current Slovak coalitions were very happy about him. Now, if you look at the polls, it's like less than 20% support Trump. So, small country, and as you said, it's not that easy to place current parties of Slovak coalition on some kind of a political scale, but it's clear that it works also for Slovak voters. But that's just a small note. But if we speak of Trump as a liability, so who is the closest to him? Maybe the Reform UK party?
That was for a case, but it's actually quite interesting how little Trump has spoken about reform, despite the massive victory. Actually, Farage hasn't been too much in the US. Under Trump 1, he was a lot. He did kind of the whole circuit, cleared up a lot of money by speaking. He has become much more marginal. I think, first of all, no one is close to Trump, but literally no one, not J.D. Vance, not Stephen Miller, just no one. He is an absolute loner, particularly because now, unlike in Trump 1, his family is not even around. Like, his daughter is nowhere to be seen. The sons you barely hear about. I mean, they're making a lot of money with doing this business, but they're not really involved in politics. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is still at times there, but also not as prominent. So he's not really close to anyone internationally, barely has met with anyone. It was remarkable that he actually knew Orban. It's also remarkable that he spoke positively about him, because he speaks positively about almost no one. I think at the moment, really no one. I mean, yes, there are affiliations with Milei to a certain extent, with the old Bolsonaro, much more than his son, who is now relevant, with Meloni, but that is already gone. Pretty much no ties to Le Pen or Wilders. There's strong ties between the AFD and the GOP, but not with Trump, right? So, I mean, Trump just floats above everything else. And pretty much everyone else tries to get his attention or get the seal of approval, whether they're, as long as other people believe that they are like supported by Trump, you can get a lot done, particularly nationally, but to a certain extent internationally.
Interesting you mentioned this with Orban, and frankly speaking, I also think it was quite remarkable that somebody like Donald Trump, who is always about everything is about Donald Trump, with him was talking so nicely about the leader of the country in the Central Europe, less than 10 million people. Now he's talking quite nicely about Polish President Karol Nawrocki. So again, some kind of connection to Central Europe, which is, in my view, quite remarkable, because I don't believe, and I don't want to be, I don't want to lash him and bash him too much, but I don't think he will be able to find it on the map. I don't know, maybe yes.
No, well, so for Orban, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, Orban was the first world leader to endorse him initially, which was, I think, not so much about Trump. It was about his opponent, Hillary Clinton, because Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, had been extremely critical of Orban, much more critical than the EU at that point in time. And so, by and large, Orban came out very early and consistently for Trump, knowing that that would take Clinton off his back, pretty much. He then invested insane amounts of money buying support from particularly Anglo-Saxon, let's call them intellectuals, as well as media people like Tucker Carlson and CPAC. And so increasingly people in Trump's orbit had connections to Orban and probably kind of conveyed all of the praise that Orban gave Trump. And once you praise, right, then you get into his mind. And again, there haven't been that many personal meetings, but he was closer to Trump and his environment than pretty much any other leader. But he spent insane amounts of money, and that already happened during Trump 1. Like, he replaced the ambassador because he thought that a woman would never get anything done. He spent much money on Congress people, etc., etc. And so finally, it did pay off in the sense that he was noted. It didn't, of course, pay off in the elections because no one votes on the basis of whether or not J.D. Vance or Trump like.
Last thing, Cas, who do you currently consider to be the most prominent figure in European far-right politics, and why him or her?
Well, Giorgia Meloni, for the simple reason that she has reached a level of mainstreaming and normalization that is incredible. I mean, you even have Keir Starmer going to Italy to learn from her about the immigration policy. I mean, von der Leyen already did that before, as did Mark Rutte. You have the EPP not overly subtly flirting with her to try and bring her into the EPP. We have a large portion of the media and politics that increasingly call her a conservative. That's how much she has been normalized, that like we don't want to call her far right anymore. Of course, not only is she an absolute product of neo-fascism, like, I mean, since her youth, she has been part of a truly neo-fascist subculture. In terms of her ideology, she hasn't changed. Like, she's still classic far-right politician, not more extreme than Le Pen or Wilders, but certainly also not less. She is relatively powerful because she is powerful in the ECR, and the ECR is pretty much mainstreamed in Europe. She is seen as reliable and as professional, and of course as pro-Ukraine. So in many ways, she is the modern far-right politician in the sense that they're just acting like any other politician and are no longer perceived as far right. That being said, she doesn't play the same role as the Le Pens used to play. She hasn't invested as much in building a far-right network for the simple reason that she doesn't need it. I mean, why should she invest in that when she has even social democrats come over, let alone the Christian Democrats? But she's also a fascinating politician because she is in many ways the opposite of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is still very much held up as the model of the far right. But he's in many ways just an anachronism. He's a dinosaur. That type of far right was the far right of the 80s, of the 90s, that just shouts, is brutal, is not real politician. The average far-right politician today is a professional politician who works within the system, transforms the system, who is relatively predictable and reliable, right? And I think Meloni is a very, very skillful version of that.
But not less dangerous.
No, I mean, to a certain extent, more dangerous because they are normalized. And so one of the things that society still has is we're vigilant and sometimes over-vigilant to people and organizations that we recognize as far-right, which today almost means that you need to be a neo-Nazi. But if it comes from almost the same message comes from the mainstream, then we just acknowledge it as mainstream. And so when the actor is accepted, then the message is accepted. And that is very much the case with Meloni. She is accepted, which means that all her xenophobia is now just whitewashed.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe and listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. The link is in the episode description. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.